Chapter 22. Killian showed up at my door 2 days later. I wasn't surprised. Lisa practically sprinted out of my apartment after our last conversation, grinning like she had just set something in motion. When I opened the door, Killian stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on me like I might disappear if he blinked. I froze. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. "Hey," he said, voice low. I swallowed. "Hey." His gaze softened as it flicked to Eli, who was clinging to my leg, staring up at him with big, curious eyes. Killian knelt down slowly, meeting Eli's gaze. "Hey, little guy." Eli blinked, tilting his head. Then, with zero hesitation, he grabbed Killian's finger and giggled. I rolled my eyes. Traitor. Killian looked up at me, smiling softly. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, but Eli tugging on Killian's hand made the decision for me. The step aside, letting him in. We sat in the living room, Eli playing with blocks at our feet. I kept waiting for Killian to start talking, but he stayed quiet, watching Eli with a look I couldn't read. Finally, I broke the silence. "Why are you here, Killian?" He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Because I can't stay away." My stomach twisted. I hated how easily those words cracked the wall I'd built around myself. I folded my arms. "You didn't seem that interested in staying before." His jaw tightened. "I know. And I regret it. Every day." I shifted uncomfortably, staring at Eli, who was happily smashing 2 blocks together. "I left for a reason." "I know," Killian said softly. "But I'm not letting you run anymore." I laughed bitterly. "You don't get to decide that." He exhaled, eyes locking onto mine. "You're right, but I'm asking for a chance. Let me prove to you that I'm not going anywhere." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got stuck in my throat. Damn him and that stupid alpha charm. "Fine," I said quietly. "But don't expect me to make this easy." A small smirk tugged at his lips. "I'd be worried if you did." Later that week, Killian took me to dinner. A real one. Candles, fancy food, the works. Lisa practically pushed me out the door, mumbling something about babysitting and don't come back too early. Dinner was easy. Easier than I thought. Killian didn't push or bring up the past too much. He just talked. Like we were normal. Like nothing had fallen apart between us. I hated how much I missed him. After dinner, we ended up at a hotel on the edge of town. The balcony overlooked the forest, and the cool night air wrapped around us as Killian kissed me, slow and deep. I leaned against the railing, hands tangled in his shirt, heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, and I felt his breath fan across my skin. "I missed you," he whispered. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I missed you too." His eyes held a softness that marked a new beginning, and I could feel the warmth of his presence enveloping me, as if the space between our hearts had finally shrunk to nothing. The forest whispered below, the rustle of leaves offering us a witness, a keeper of our secrets. This was Killian, the man I had loved and lost, now standing before me, a second chance at our love. He stepped back, eyes flickering with a spark of mischief, and in that silent dialogue, I understood the invitation. We moved slowly, savoring how our bodies gravitated toward one another like moths drawn to a flame. Killian took my hand, guiding me back inside, where candlelight danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to dream with us. The air thickened with unvoiced words, desires uncharted. With careful deliberation, he disentangled my hair from the clasp that held it, letting it cascade around my shoulders like a curtain that shrouded us in intimacy. His fingers brushed against my skin, tracing the lines of my collarbone, igniting a trail of warmth that followed wherever he touched. I melted against him as he pulled me closer, his hands cradling my face, thumbs stroking my cheeks. That moment felt suspended in time, each heartbeat a soft crescendo leading us to something profound. The world outside faded, leaving only the echo of our breaths and the rhythm of our bodies in perfect sync. As his lips met mine again, slowly exploring, I marveled at the depth of the connection we were reigniting. There was no rush, only the exquisite tension of longing being met with gentle promise. Each kiss was meticulous, as if he had memorized every curve and contour of my mouth, while I drank from his bittersweet and familiar taste. The bed welcomed us like an old friend, and we sank into its embrace, the sheets calm and inviting against our heated skin. I felt him ease back, his eyes searching mine, asking unspoken questions that hung in the air. With a nod, I gave my silent consent, and he dove into the depths of our shared intimacy. Every caress was deliberate and unhurried, as if we were tracing the map of each other's souls. I marveled at the tenderness of his touch as his fingers laced through mine, interlocking in a way that whispered promises of commitment and rebuilding. The weight of the past melted away with each gentle thrust, each whisper uttered between breaths, transforming the space between us into a sanctuary. We moved together, pulses synchronizing, heartbeats intertwining in a beautiful dance that felt foreign and familiar. The candlelight flickered, casting a warm glow that seemed to pulse in time with our rhythm. With every sigh and gasp, we crafted a language that was ours alone, filled with the nuances of rediscovered love and the hope for healing. In that sanctuary, every glance was an unspoken vow, and each shared breath carried the weight of the world beyond the walls, dissolving into shadows. Our bodies responded to one another as if we were the missing pieces of an intricate puzzle, fitting perfectly into each other's warmth. I could feel his heart racing beneath my palm, a testament to the emotions we finally allowed ourselves to express. Killian shifted, deepening our connection, and I arched into him, surrendering to the sensations that chased away every worry and doubt. He lowered his head, brushing kisses along my collarbone, igniting sparks of electricity that shot through me, making me forget the world outside those moments. "Stay with me," he murmured against my skin, his voice thick with emotion, as if he could read the fear of losing this fragile intimacy. I nodded, unable to form the words, knowing he felt the strength of my resolve in how I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer as if by starting anew, we could erase the scars left by the past. The night unfolded like a promise made in the fleeting moments of daylight, and time slipped through our fingers as we fell deeper into our shared embrace. Hours melted into breaths, and with each heartbeat, I felt the pieces of our love knitting together. Stronger, bolder, steadfast. In that cocoon of affection, we forged something beautiful out of our shared vulnerability. The scars of our past and the fear of losing each other, now laid bare and healed by our rekindled love. The next morning, I woke up tangled in the sheets, Killian's arm draped over my waist. I stared at the ceiling, reality creeping in. This felt too easy, too perfect. Killian shifted beside me, pressing a soft kiss against my shoulder. "You're thinking too hard," he muttered, voice thick with sleep. I sighed. "I can't help it." He propped himself up on one elbow, brushing a stray curl from my face. "I know things are complicated, but I want this. I want us." I met his gaze, heart fluttering. "It's not that simple, Killian. Your pack—" He cut me off, his hand resting gently on my stomach. "I'll step down." I froze. "What?" "If that's what it takes," he said, eyes steady. "I'll step down as future alpha. The pack can find someone else." My heart pounded. "Killian, you can't." "I can," he said. "I can make, and I will. Nothing matters more than you and Eli. Not the pack, not the title, nothing." Tears pricked the back of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "You're serious," I whispered. "Completely." I searched his face for any sign of hesitation, but there wasn't any. He meant it, and just like that, the wall around my heart started to crumble. Chapter 23. I stared at the mirror, smoothing down my sweater for the 5th time. It wasn't fancy, but I figured not overdressing was the safest bet for this. Killian's pack event. The words alone made my stomach twist. I wasn't sure if I was ready to step back into that world, the one I ran from. But Killian asked, and something about the way he said, "I want you there," made it hard to say no. Milo sat on the bed, chewing the ear of his stuffed wolf, oblivious to the fact that his mom was mentally spiraling. "You look fine," Killian said from the doorway, leaning casually against the frame. He'd been ready for half an hour, and it showed. Clean cut, dark shirt, confident as ever. I glanced at him through the mirror. "I feel like I'm about to walk into a room full of people who want me gone." Killian crossed the room and wrapped his arms around my waist from behind. His chin rested lightly on my shoulder. "I won't let that happen." I sighed, leaning into him just a little. "You can't control how they see me." He pressed a soft kiss behind my ear. "They'll come around, because you'll scare them into it," I teased. Killian smirked. "Maybe." The pack house was buzzing when we arrived. Cars lined the driveway, and the sound of laughter and conversation spilled out from the open doors. I clutched Milo's hand tighter as we walked up. Killian gave me a reassuring glance but didn't say anything. Inside, the place was packed. Wolves filled the main hall, mingling in groups, and I spotted familiar faces from Nova Systems. A few glanced our way, their eyes flicking between me and Killian like they weren't sure what to think. Lisa appeared out of nowhere, grinning like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Look who finally showed up." I rolled my eyes. "Happy to disappoint you by existing." She crouched down to Milo's level, holding out her hand like he was royalty. "Hey, Milo, remember me?" Milo stared at her for a second before offering his stuffed wolf. Lisa took it. inspecting it like it was the most important thing in the room. "Very impressive," she said. Milo giggled, and just like that, I relaxed, at least a little. Killian kept me close as we wove through the crowd. Some people nodded politely, but I caught the sideways glances, the whispers. I pretended not to hear them. By the time we reached the dining area, I was ready to grab a plate and hide in the corner. But Killian had other plans. He guided me toward the front, right where the higher-ranked members were gathered. I swallowed hard as his grandfather's familiar figure appeared by the fireplace. He was mid-conversation, but stopped the second he saw us. His sharp gaze flicked to Milo, then back to me. I stiffened, but Killian's hand rested on the small of my back, grounding me. "Alpha," Killian said formally, nodding to his grandfather. The older man's eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before he stepped forward. I braced for whatever he was about to say, but to my surprise, he extended his hand. "Welcome back, Ray," he said, voice calm but sincere. I blinked, trying to process if I'd heard him right. I shook his hand carefully. "Thank you. It's good to be back." He glanced at Milo and gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it felt like a mountain had shifted. As his grandfather walked away, Killian leaned down and whispered, "Told you they'd come around." I narrowed my eyes. "You bribed him, didn't you?" Killian grinned. "I like to call it persuasion." I laughed softly, shaking my head. Maybe this wasn't going to be as bad as I thought. I knew things were too calm. After the pack event, it felt like Killian and I finally had some breathing room. His grandfather wasn't hovering. People stopped whispering, and for once, I didn't feel like I was one wrong move away from being shoved out of Orion Falls. But peace never lasted long in Killian's world. It started with a letter. I was in the kitchen, cutting up fruit from Milo, when Killian walked in, holding a piece of parchment like it might catch fire in his hands. "What's that?" I asked, wiping my hands on a towel. Killian set it on the table, jaw tight. "A challenge." I frowned. "Challenge? For what?" Killian ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Alpha Terran. He's from the Blackridge Pack. He's questioning my ability to lead." I froze. Because of me? Killian's silence was answer enough. I felt the weight in my chest tighten. "It means I have to answer him." "Oh, yeah." Later that night, we stood outside the pack house as the Blackridge wolves gathered at the border. Their alpha, Tehran, stood at the front, arms crossed and smug as ever. I didn't like him. Milo was with Lisa back at our apartment, but I could still feel Killian's tension buzzing under his skin. "This is ridiculous," I muttered under my breath. Killian glanced at me. "It'll be fine." "Define fine." Killian didn't answer, but the slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth told me he was enjoying this more than he let on. Terran stepped forward, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Killian, you've grown soft. Your pack needs strength, and you've been, distracted." His eyes flicked to me, lingering just long enough to make my skin crawl. Killian's expression didn't change, but the air around him shifted. "If you're here to complain, Tyron," Killian said coolly, "you can turn around, or I can show you the way out." Some of the Blackridge wolves chuckled, but Tyron didn't. I'm here to challenge your leadership. You've let your personal life get in the way of pack duty. Killian took a step forward, standing his ground. It is when it makes you weak. The wolves behind Killian growled low, but he held up a hand, stopping them. Taryn smirked. You're letting an outsider influence you. Everyone knows it. This pack deserves better. I clenched my fists, but Killian's calm gaze never wavered. If you think Ray makes me weak, Killian said, voice steady and cold, then you haven't been paying attention. Taryn's eyes narrowed. Is that so? Killian stepped closer, towering over him. Challenge me all you want, but disrespecting Ray? His voice dropped lower, almost a growl. That's not going to end well for you. Taryn's smirk faded. I stood there, heart racing, as Killian turned back to the pack. His hand brushed mine briefly, a quiet reassurance. But just as I thought the confrontation was over, Taryn's voice cut through the air. I issue a formal duel, he announced. Next full moon, the crowd fell silent. My heart dropped. Killian's shoulders tensed, but he didn't hesitate. Fine, Taryn smirked. See you then. The Blackridge wolves left, disappearing into the woods. I turned to Killian, panic rising. A duel? Killian? That's dangerous. He met my gaze, calm as ever. I know. Then why agree to it? His hand cupped my cheek gently, thumb brushing against my skin. Because I won't let anyone question what we are. I swallowed hard, leaning into his touch. I don't care what they think. I do. Killian's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. This isn't just about me. It's about you and Milo. They need to know you're part of this pack. And I'm not backing down. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him it wasn't worth the risk. But looking at him, I knew it was. Killian wasn't fighting just for his title. He was fighting for us. Chapter 24. Killian was up before the sun. Every morning I heard the front door creak as he left to train. He tried to be quiet, but the soft click of the door always woke me. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was the day I packed up and left. I hated thinking like that. But with every hour that passed, the duel felt closer and more dangerous. Milo cooed softly in his crib, and I rolled over, watching his tiny chest rise and fall. Leaving meant keeping him safe. Staying meant risking it all. By the time Killian came back, shirt damp with sweat and hair a mess, I was in the kitchen feeding Milo mashed bananas. Killian kissed the top of my head as he passed, stealing a piece of toast off my plate. How was training? I asked, trying to sound normal. Killian shrugged. Tiring. Taryn's strong, but he fights dirty. I need to be ready for that. I swallowed hard, focusing on Milo's tiny spoon. You don't have to do this, you know. Killian leaned against the counter, watching me carefully. I do. Killian? I won't let anyone threaten you or Milo, he said softly. Not now, not ever. My chest tightened, but I didn't argue, because deep down, I knew there was no stopping him. Later that day, I found myself pacing the living room. Milo was asleep, but I wasn't tired. I kept replaying Killian's words in my head over and over. He was willing to fight for us, but at what cost? I glanced at Milo curled up in his crib and felt that familiar weight settle in my chest. I couldn't keep doing this. Running, hiding, second-guessing every decision. Killian wasn't scared. Why was I? I kept replaying every decision, second-guessing every decision. Killian wasn't scared. Why was I? The next morning, I made a decision. Milo and I left the apartment early, bundled up against the cold. I followed the path Killian took every day, winding through the woods until I reached the open clearing where the pack trained. I spotted Killian immediately. He was sparring with Jonah, sweat dripping down his neck as he dodged a punch and countered with ease. His muscles tensed and shifted as he moved, every step calculated and strong. I almost turned around, but Milo giggled softly, tugging on my scarf. Killian heard it. He froze mid-step, eyes locking on us from across the clearing. Jonah paused too, following his gaze. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Killian smiled, the kind of smile that made my heart stumble. I walked toward him, balancing Milo on my hip. "You brought backup?" Killian teased, wiping his face with a towel. "Figured you could use the encouragement," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Killian's gaze softened as he reached out, running his fingers gently over Milo's hair. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. I met his eyes, heart pounding. I wasn't sure either. Killian's thumb brushed against my hand, grounding me. But I didn't pull away. I wasn't leaving. Not this time. Chapter 25. The full moon hung heavy in the sky, casting silver light over the clearing. Wolves gathered along the edges, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The air buzzed with anticipation, but no one spoke. The challenge was clear. Killian and Taryn. Alpha against alpha. I stood near the tree line, holding Milo close to my chest, his tiny head resting against my shoulder. Liesel hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly, as if she could will this to end early. I hated this. Killian stood at the center of the clearing, his muscles tense beneath the faint light. He looked calm, but I knew him too well to believe that. Taryn paced opposite him, rolling his neck, cracking his knuckles. His wolf was close to the surface. I could see it in the sharpness of his eyes and the way his teeth flashed. Jonah stepped forward between them, raising his hand. "This is a formal challenge," he said, his voice close to the surface. I could see it in the sharpness of his eyes and the way his teeth flashed. Jonah stepped forward between them, raising his hand. Grace Dudinary, crossing his arms. Grace, no outside interference. The duel ends when one yields. Killian's gaze flicked to me for a split second. I tightened my grip on Milo and nodded. "I trust you." Jonah dropped his hand. "Begin." Killian shifted immediately, bones cracking and muscles stretching as his wolf erupted forward in a flash of black fur. His claws tore into the dirt, lips curling into a snarl. Killian stayed human. The crowd murmured. I held my breath. Taryn lunged, but Killian sidestepped smoothly, his eyes sharp and calculating. His wolf was beneath the surface. I could feel it, but he was holding it back. "He's waiting." Taryn snarled again, swiping at Killian's chest. His claws grazed Killian's arm, ripping his sleeve. The scent of blood filled the air. A low growl rumbled in Killian's throat, and then I saw it. His eyes flashed gold. In a heartbeat, Killian shifted. His body twisted and stretched, fur rippling over muscle. Where Killian once stood, a massive gray wolf towered over Taryn. The pack shifted nervously, the sheer size of Killian's wolf demanding attention. He was larger, stronger, an alpha in every sense of the word. Taryn lunged again, but Killian met him head-on, their bodies crashing together with enough force to shake the ground. I flinched as they rolled, snarling and snapping, their claws tearing into the earth. Killian pinned Taryn easily, teeth bared near his throat, but Taryn wasn't done. He twisted beneath Killian, raking his claws along Killian's side. A pained yelp echoed through the clearing, and Killian stumbled back. "No," I whispered, my heart racing. Killian shook himself, blood staining his fur. His growl deepened, and I saw his wolf's fury burn hotter. He lunged forward again, slamming into Taryn with relentless force. This time, Taryn didn't stand a chance. Killian's jaws closed around the back of Taryn's neck, holding him down as Taryn's body trembled beneath him. Jonah stepped forward, watching carefully. Taryn slapped his paw against the ground twice. Yield. The crowd erupted into howls, but I didn't move. My eyes stayed on Killian as he released Taryn, panting hard, his side still bleeding. His golden gaze found me in the crowd. I ran to him without thinking, Milo pressing into my chest. Killian shifted back, sweat glistening on his skin as he crouched down, resting his hands on his knees. I swallowed the lump in my throat, brushing a thumb over his cheek. "I hate you," I whispered, but my voice trembled. Killian's hand wrapped around mine, pulling me closer. "I love you too." Tears pricked the back of my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I let them fall. Because no matter how dangerous this world was, Killian wasn't letting go, and neither was I. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, but I barely noticed it. Killian sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His eyes hadn't left me since we sat down, and the weight of his stare made my heart pound louder than I wanted to admit. His arm was bandaged from the duel, but he acted like it didn't bother him. Typical. Milo slept soundly in the crib by the window, his tiny breaths filling the quiet space. Killian's voice broke the silence. "I want to talk about us." I tensed. I knew this was coming, but I'd hoped for a little more breathing room. I picked at the edge of the couch cushion, avoiding his gaze. "Okay." Killian straightened, his eyes softening just slightly. "I want to make this official, Ray." "I want to make this official, Ray." I looked up, blinking. "Official?" His lips twitched into a small smile. "A mating bond." My stomach flipped. "Killian?" "Before you say no," he cut in gently, "I'm not asking for an answer right now." I shut my mouth, heart racing. A mating bond wasn't just some casual promise. It was permanent. A tie between souls, one that couldn't be undone. Killian leaned back against the couch, his eyes locked on mine. "You're not going to ask me out. Sorry. You've too much of a temper. I love you. I love Milo. But I know you've fought hard to build your life on your own. I don't want to take that away from you." I swallowed hard, struggling to find words. I'm not asking you to give anything up, he said quietly. I just want to stand next to you, as your mate, as Milo's father. His words hung in the air, heavy but gentle. I wanted to say yes. I almost did. But something inside me hesitated. I glanced at Milo, his tiny hand curled near his cheek as he slept. This wasn't just about me. I stopped, rubbing the back of my neck. Killian, I don't know if I'm ready for that. His expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He covered it quickly. I get it, he said softly. I can wait. So long I felt like I was the one running away. I just walked constantly where Lady walked to my bed with her huge paws. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight pressing down on me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Before he stepped out, he saw the door. I swallowed. Before he stepped out, he paused. I need to think, he said softly. Even if you say no. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. When the door closed behind him, I stood there for a long time, wondering why I felt like I was the one running away. I swallowed the lump in my throat, even if you say no. I swallowed the lump in my throat and throbbed it. Chapter 26. The next morning, I sat on the floor with Milo, stacking wooden blocks into a crooked tower. Milo giggled as the blocks wobbled, then collapsed. Boom, I laughed softly. Yeah, that's what happens when you build too high, buddy. He looked up at me with wide eyes, clearly expecting me to rebuild it. I reached for the blocks, but before I could, he did something that made my heart stop. Milo grabbed one of the blocks and held it out, toward the door. Dadahe? He asked, his little voice full of hope. I froze. Killian wasn't even here, but Milo still looked for him. I swallowed the lump in my throat and ran a hand through Milo's soft hair. He's not home right now, baby. Milo frowned, but kept holding the block like Killian might walk in any second. I sat there, watching him. It wasn't the first time Milo had done this. Over the past few weeks, I'd noticed how much he watched Killian, how his face lit up whenever Killian walked into the room. I thought I was protecting Milo by keeping things slow, by holding back. But maybe I was just afraid of messing things up, afraid of letting Killian in too close. Milo didn't have that fear. He trusted Killian completely. I let out a shaky breath and hugged Milo close. Maybe it was time I did too. That evening, I knocked on Killian's door. It opened almost immediately, like he'd been waiting. Killian stood there, barefoot, his shirt slightly rumpled like he'd just finished a long day. His eyes softened when he saw me. Hey. I shifted nervously. Milo perched on my hip. Can we come in? Killian stepped aside, and I walked in, letting Milo down so he could toddle into the living room. Killian watched me carefully, leaning against the back of the couch. Everything okay? I nodded, fiddling with the edge of my sweater. Yeah. I just wanted to talk. Killian didn't say anything, but he looked at me like he already knew where this was going. I took a deep breath, finally meeting his gaze. I'm ready. His eyes narrowed slightly. Ready for what? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. The bond. I nodded, stepping closer. I'm sure. Milo already made up his mind, and I think I'm done running. "I love you, Ray," he murmured. I smiled, my heart feeling lighter than it had in months. "I love you too." Milo waddled over, holding up a block proudly. "Dada," he said, grinning. Killian chuckled, lifting Milo into his arms. "I guess he made the decision for us." I laughed softly, leaning into Killian's side as Milo babbled happily. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. The moon hung low over the forest, its light spilling through the trees like silver ribbons. The air smelled like pine and earth, and the faint sound of wolves howling in the distance carried through the night. I stood at the edge of the pack's sacred grounds, heart thudding in my chest. Killian stood a few feet away, dressed simply in a dark shirt and jeans. But even in the soft glow of the moonlight, he looked every bit the alpha, strong, calm, and completely focused on me. The rest of the pack stayed behind, giving us space. This was our moment. Milo was with Lisa, probably sleeping through the whole thing, which was for the best. As much as I adored him, bonding ceremonies weren't exactly toddler-friendly. Killian stepped closer, and I felt the familiar warmth spread through my chest. His eyes never left mine as he reached for my hands, his fingers threading through mine. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly, his voice low and steady. I nodded, tightening my grip. "I've never been more sure of anything." His lips curved into a small smile. "I wasn't going to let you back out anyway." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't stop the smile tugging at my lips. "I figured." It had been such a relief to let go of Jake's hand. The breeze brushed against my skin, and the world felt still, like the forest itself was waiting. "Then I'm yours. Always." His lips met mine in a slow, deep kiss that made my knees weak. As the kiss deepened, I felt it, the soft hum of magic in the air, wrapping around us like a thread being pulled tight. It wasn't something I could see, but I felt the connection snap into place, locking us together in a way that felt ancient, permanent. When Killian pulled back, his golden eyes flashed briefly. His wolf was close, but calm. "It's done," he murmured. I rested my head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. We stayed like that for a while, wrapped in the quiet stillness of the forest. Later that night, we walked back to the house, Milo snuggled between us, half asleep in Killian's arms. As we stepped inside, Killian set Milo down gently on the couch, covering him with a blanket. I leaned against the doorway, watching them. Killian glanced at me, tilting his head. "You're staring," I smirked. "I'm just thinking." His brow lifted. "About what?" I crossed the room, brushing my fingers through Milo's soft curls before standing in front of Killian. "I didn't want to tell you before the ceremony," I said softly. "I wanted tonight to be about us." Killian frowned slightly. "Tell me what?" I grabbed his hand and placed it against my stomach, watching as realization slowly dawned in his eyes. His voice trailed off. I nodded. "We're having another baby." Killian stared at me, his hands still resting gently on my stomach. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there, processing. Then, his arms wrapped around me, lifting me off the ground as he spun us in a circle, laughter rumbling from his chest. "You're serious?" he asked, still holding me tight. I laughed against his shoulder. "Completely serious." Killian set me down, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "You really don't do anything halfway, do you?" I grinned up at him. "Apparently not." He kissed me again, slower this time, his hands lingering at my waist. "I love you," he whispered against my lips. "I love you too," I said, smiling. And for the first time, I knew this was exactly where I was meant to be. Chapter 27. "He's too strong. I can't hold him off." Milo giggled harder, climbing onto Killian's chest. "I win," Killian grinned, brushing Milo's curls out of his face. "You're getting stronger every day, kid." I smiled, resting my chin on my hand. "Don't let him get a big head. He'll start challenging the other toddlers." Killian glanced at me, smirking. "Hey, it's never too early to learn how to fight." I raised an eyebrow. "He's two, Killian." Killian sat up, Milo still clinging to his arm like a koala. "Exactly. By the time he's 5, he'll be ready for pack training." Milo perked up, eyes wide. "Train?" Killian grinned at him. "You want to be strong like Dad?" Milo nodded enthusiastically. I laughed, shaking my head. "You're ridiculous." Killian winked. "It's part of my charm." Milo slid off Killian's lap and toddled over to his toy box, humming to himself as he dug through the pile. Killian crawled onto the couch, stretching his arm behind me. I leaned into him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest. "I can't believe how far we've come," I said softly, watching Milo try to fit blocks together. Killian kissed the top of my head. "We've come a long way, and it's only going to get better." I smiled, curling closer to him. "You really think that?" He tilted his head down to meet my eyes. "I know it." Milo waddled back over, holding one of his toy wolves. "Fight, Daddy." Killian chuckled. "All right, little alpha, let's see what you've got." As they wrestled again, I sat back, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Killian wasn't just the alpha of the pack. He was ours. Chapter 28. The pack gathered under the full moon, the clearing glowing in soft silver light. Killian stood at the front, tall and proud, his hand wrapped around mine. Milo sat on his shoulders, holding onto his hair like it was his personal jungle gym. Jonah stepped forward, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "Tonight we recognize Killian Voss as our alpha." The pack howled in approval, the sound echoing through the trees. Milo giggled, clapping his hands excitedly. Killian leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. "You ready for this?" I squeezed his hand. "As long as you are." His eyes softened. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." I smiled up at him. "I know." He laughed, shaking his head. "Remind me never to let you get too confident." Milo tugged on his hair. "Go, Daddy." Killian grinned, pulling him down off his shoulders and into his arms. "Guess I've got my biggest fan right here." The pack slowly began to drift back toward the pack house, but we stayed behind, watching the stars peek out between the trees. Killian wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me closer. The forest was quiet, and for once, everything felt right. I leaned into him, resting my head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd be here," I whispered. With you? With all of this? Killian kissed the top of my head. I'm glad you stayed. I smiled softly, tracing small circles on his hand. Me too, Milo yawned, curling against Killian's chest. His little hands clutched at his dad's shirt, and Killian rocked him gently. As I watched them, I felt that I froze, hand instinctively pressing against my belly. Killian noticed immediately. Ray? I looked up at him, eyes wide. I felt the baby kick. His gaze softened, and for a second, he just stared at me, taking in the moment. Really? He whispered, his hand moving to rest over mine. I nodded, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. Yeah. Killian's arms tightened around me, holding me like I was the most precious thing in the world. Yeah, I nodded my nod. I love you, he said, voice thick with emotion. I smiled through the tears, leaning into him. I love you too. As we stood there, wrapped in each other and the life we were building, I knew we'd found something rare, something worth fighting for. A home, a family, a future. And as Milo snored softly against Killian's chest, and our unborn child shifted gently inside me, I realized I didn't need anything else. This was everything. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the yard as Milo chased fireflies through the grass. His laughter rang out, loud and wild, as Killian followed close behind, pretending to be slower than he was. Careful, I called from the porch, cradling the sleeping baby in my arms. Milo barely glanced over his shoulder. I'm fast, Mommy. Daddy can't catch me. Killian grinned, letting out a playful growl. You sure about that? Milo squealed, bolting across the yard. I smiled, rocking gently in the old wooden chair as the warm summer breeze brushed through my hair. The baby stirred slightly, his tiny hand curling around my finger. Killian jogged over, swooping Milo up into his arms. Caught you, he teased, tossing him into the air before setting him down. Mommy, did you see? I saw, I said, laughing as he climbed onto the porch and plopped down at my feet. Killian joined us, crouching beside my chair. He leaned over, brushing his lips softly against mine. Everything okay? He asked quietly, his eyes dropping to the baby nestled against me. I nodded, feeling the warmth in my chest that I always did when he looked at me like that. But as Killian's arm wrapped around me, and the soft sounds of our family filled the air, I realized happiness wasn't something you found. It was something you built. And no matter what came next, I knew one thing for certain. We'd built this together, and we always would.